I lived in Manhattan for a number of years on the A train, so we might have seen each other. Yeah, so I'm a psychiatrist by training, and but I was studying the AIDS epidemic in New York City, and it was pointed out to me by some genius ecologists that the AIDS epidemic was linked to policies that had destroyed the inner city and created the crisis of homelessness, crisis of housing that still exists. And of course, it exists all across the country, which is why we have homelessness, because we don't have enough housing. So, I didn't understand how the AIDS epidemic could be linked to losing your house or having your neighborhood burned down. So I came across this idea that somebody said there should be a psychology of place. And that made sense. It seemed to me that was what would help me understand how is an AIDS epidemic linked to a crisis of housing. So I started studying the psychology of place. And one of the first people I met was a man named David Jenkins, who told me he'd just been homeless all his life. He was at that time a client of Housing Works. I don't know if you ever heard of Housing Works. And he was living in various places, but then he was living in I forget exactly what they call it, but it's sort of where it's a single room occupancy hotel that was sort of supportive housing that he had got into. And so David and I became collaborators, and he helped me understand the psychology of place. So we met once a month for like 10 years, during which time he was able to get sober. He had AIDS. As his AIDS got worse, he was actually one of the first people with AIDS to get a kidney transplant, which helped extend his life. And as he got sober, he was able to, put his life together, recreate a family that cared for him in his last days. So, as part of trying to understand that, we went a lot of places together. So he took me to his single-room occupancy hotel. Then later he lived at the Times Square, the big building on 43rd, I think it's 43rd Street. And then he lived then he was in Philadelphia. He went back home. Anyway, we went a lot of places so that he could explain his story to me. And that's why I said, if you want to know about somebody's life, ask them about their places. Both because it's an interesting series of places. Where were they? But also because if you understand the way the relationship with the place unfolded, then you understand what they've lived. So the main thing is that I learned from studying the psychology of place and how it links to AIDS is that we love our places. Very complicated relationships, but if that relationship is ruptured, it is very painful, and it breaks a whole variety of connections that we have. And then if we're not able to repair those kinds of connections, or this whole range of connections, then we live in a kind of limbo. And that's really where David was when I met him. He was in a kind of limbo of just having been lost so many places and not, living in these SROs. And, being in active addiction, was very much in limbo. And then he got out of limbo and he made a home again. And it was quite a gift that he shared his journey with me. And so I think, if you say to somebody, well, if you had trauma, it takes them to a very negative place, right? But if you say to somebody, where have you lived? They will tell you about the whole thing, because where you lived is also about your favorite tree on the block, or somebody you spoke to, or a whole variety of things. That's what Mike always talks about asset-based community development. It's sort of asset-based human storytelling. Start with where have you been, and then you find out the whole thing. But David really helped me understand the pain of what he talked about as having been homeless his whole life. So that's how I got to that bit of suggestion of how to get to know people. Well, I'll tell you the last part. In psychiatry, Freud, he said, ask people about their sex lives. That's what Freud said. That was the great way to understand people. But now everybody knows that, so if you ask somebody about their sex life, they oh no, if I tell you my sex life. But nobody yet knows this secret, that if you ask people about where they've lived, you're telling them everything about yourself. So it's still a secret, but it really is how to know everything about a person, but also in this asset-based way.